The history of the Broadway musical. Table of contents.
All about Broadway. With visiting and touring information, geography, history, attractions, and other points of interest.
Dr. Sydney Soclof. Dr. Sydney22@gmail.com. 2023. Narration by Dr. Sydney Soclof.
Zoe Phonemes.
And Nathan Koltove. For a complete discussion of YouTube navigation, please go to tinyurl.com/ytnavigator. For the related and recommended videos, click on the icon in the upper right corner, and then select from the playlists. As in this example, these lists are scrollable. Then from each playlist, select the video from the resulting drop-down list. As in this example, these lists are also scrollable.
The history of the Broadway musical. Movie next. Give my regards to Broadway James Cagney. It is indeed New York City, the Big Apple, and Broadway that is the focal point of the musical and dramatic theater in America.
The rise of the Big Apple, and the history of the Broadway musical.
Broadway is both a place and a metonym for a form of theater. As a place, it is a street on the island of Manhattan in New York City. As a word, it represents a theatrical art form known as the American musical theater.
As such, it's had its beginnings on Broadway, but is now found in tens of thousands of community theaters and high school and college productions all over this country. It's, for example, a production of Fiddler on the Roof that I recently attended in Clackamas, Oregon, very far from Broadway in New York. Broadway shows also appear in various forms in film and television.
This is Broadway in Times Square. What is a musical?
A musical is a stage, television or film production utilizing popular style songs and dialogue to either tell a story, as in the case of a book musical, or in the case of revues, to showcase the talents of varied performers, mostly singers and dancers.
A revue has a series of unrelated acts or scenes that do not follow any particular storyline.
In a book musical, there is a continuous storyline throughout the production.
Musical theater had its beginnings in the union of song and drama in opera. Musicals have been of many types throughout history: comic operas, operettas, opera bouffe, burlesque and vaudeville, burletta, extravaganza, musical comedy, and the modern Broadway-type musical.
In comparison to opera, most American musical theater has been popular theater, created for the vast majority of the people, although that may no longer be the case in more recent years.
The book of a musical is not the original source material or novel. It draws from that, but is the combination of the plot, characterization of people and scenes, and ultimately the dialogue that is the book of a musical.
The combination of the spoken dialogue and the lyrics, or words, of the songs is called the libretto, and the person who writes the libretto is a librettist.
Musical theater is perhaps the most collaborative of the arts, involving the work of the librettist, composer, lyricist, director, choreographer, actors, singers, dancers, scenery designers, costume designers, lighting designers, and the various components of the stage crew. Musicals throughout history.
The ancient Greeks included music and dance in many of their stage comedies and tragedies as early as the 5th century BC.
The Romans copied and expanded the forms and traditions of Greek theater. The 3rd century BC comedies included song and dance routines performed with full orchestration.
In the Middle Ages, traveling minstrels and roving troupes of performers offered popular songs and slapstick comedy.
In the 12th and 13th centuries, there was also a tradition of religious dramas.
In the Renaissance, the commedia dell'arte was an Italian tradition where raucous clowns improvised their way through familiar stories. This set the course for Western stage comedy for centuries to come.
Examples of a type of more popular opera that featured spoken as well as sung dialogue, and was often in the vernacular as the comic opera Singspiel, as exemplified by some of the operas of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart such as Don Giovanni, The Marriage of Figaro and The Magic Flute.
We will now have an excerpt from Mozart's opera, The Marriage of Figaro, with the aria Voi che sapete. The boy Cherubino, whose name means little cherub, is infatuated with an older woman, the Countess. He is really not at all sure whether she would ever reciprocate the love that he offers her. But he recklessly tests the waters by singing to her a song, sung by Maria Ewing, that he has composed for her and her alone. We will now have an excerpt from Mozart's opera, Don Giovanni, with the song, Madami nel catalogo e questo. Another very popular Singspiel, or singing play by Mozart, is The Magic Flute.
We will now have an excerpt from Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute, with Papageno singing the Birdcatcher Song. Opéra bouffe is a genre of late 19th century French operetta, closely associated with Jacques Offenbach, who produced many of them at the Théâtre des Bouffes Parisiennes, that gave its name to the form. Opéras bouffes are known for elements of comedy, satire, parody and farce.
La vie parisienne, or Parisian life, is an opéra bouffe, or operetta, composed by Jacques Offenbach, and produced in 1866.
We will now have an excerpt from Jacques Offenbach's operetta, La vie parisienne, with the song, Tu tourne, tourne, tourne. We will now have an excerpt of the finale of Jacques Offenbach's operetta, La vie parisienne. Burlesque is a literary, dramatic or musical work intended to cause laughter by caricaturing more serious works. The word derives from the Italian burlesco, which, in turn, is derived from the Italian burla, a joke, ridicule or mockery.
A burletta, from the Italian, meaning little joke, is a brief comic Italian and later English opera. The term was used in the 18th century to denote the comic intermezzo or interludes between the acts of an opera, but was sometimes given to more extended works.
An opera is a dramatic theater presentation in which all the dialogue is sung, and the music is continuous, or almost so. Ballad opera used popular songs, or ballads and tunes of the day. Usually new lyrics were applied to old and familiar tunes. An example is John Gay's The Beggar's Opera, 1728, which borrowed popular songs of the day and rewrote the lyrics. We will now have an excerpt from John Gay's The Beggar's Opera. Comic operas had original scores and mostly romantic plot lines in addition to music. There was comedy, and usually a happy ending. An example of comic opera is Michael Balfe's The Bohemian Girl, 1845.
The basic elements of both comic opera and operetta are 1. A story with music of a more popular nature than opera. 2. Spoken dialogue. 3. Comic interludes. 4. A happy ending. The difference between comic opera and operetta is that operetta has a somewhat more fanciful tone than comic opera.
Examples of operettas are the Gilbert and Sullivan operettas in the late 1800s, as in The Pirates of Penzance,
and the HMS Pinafore.
We will now have the song, He is an Englishman, from the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, HMS Pinafore.
Most theater was imported from Europe, and European forms dominated musical theater in colonial America. Plays and operettas were deeply entrenched in the stiff Victorian style.
It was not until the 1920s that the great American playwrights would be making their mark. Up to that time, most plays were formula melodramas. It took many years for the American musical theater to acquire its own identity.
The first musical production in the colonies was Flora, a ballad opera imported from England.
The performance took place at the Dock Street Theater in Charleston, South Carolina in 1736.
The Dock Street Theater was the first building in America built exclusively to be used for theatrical performances. The English ballad opera remained popular in the colonies for several decades.
We will now see an excerpt of a rehearsal of Flora, an opera, at the Dock Street Theater. After the colonies became a nation, a new kind of stage production began to attract interest: burlesque. At that time, burlesque consisted of travesties on, or parodies of famous plays. Performers or dancers in song, dance, pantomime and dialogue.
Why Broadway?
Broadway is a street in Manhattan that starts at the lower end of Manhattan, and then follows an old Indian trail, diagonally up to the northern end of the island. The island of Manhattan is 12 miles long, and 2.5 miles wide.
The Bronx is the only borough of the 5 boroughs of New York City that is on the mainland. The other 4 are on islands.
Let's first look at Broadway as a place, a street on the island of Manhattan in New York City. Broadway begins at the southern tip of Manhattan, and runs the full length of the island to the northern tip at the Harlem River.
This is the view looking up Broadway in Lower Manhattan.
This is the flag of the Dutch West India Company.
The lower tip of Manhattan, with Wall Street as its northern boundary, was the area of the original Dutch settlement of New York City, then called New Amsterdam. Note that this southern tip of Manhattan has been increased in area since those days by landfill.
The Dutch first settled here in 1624. A fort called Fort Amsterdam was built at the southern tip of Manhattan Island.
From the very beginning, this was a cosmopolitan commercial town. New Amsterdam was a company town, owned, operated and controlled by the Dutch West India Company.
These are the European colonies in North America in 1650.
The Dutch West India Company was a company formed by Dutch merchants that had a trade monopoly in the Dutch possessions in the Americas, which included Brazil and the Caribbean.
This included not just New Amsterdam, but the entire large territory of New Netherland that had been claimed by the Dutch.
Here is New Netherland from 1616 to 1664. Note the boundary between the Dutch and English, and the Dutch placed names like Brooklyn, Flushing, Sint Sings, and Kinderhook.
Here is New Amsterdam around 1650.
The city tavern was built in 1642 and served as the Stadhuis, or City Hall, from 1653 to 1667.
As the original part of New York City, Manhattan Island offered an excellent port for seagoing vessels in the age of sailing ships.
This was, first of all, because of the protected waters of New York Bay beyond the Narrows, where the Verrazano Narrows Bridge is today.
Here is the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, looking back into New York Harbor.
The Hudson was called the Nord River by the Dutch, the Delaware in the southern part of their colony being the South River.
Secondly, both the North and East rivers are tidal in nature, flowing in one direction as the tide comes in, and reversing direction as the tide goes out. This made it easier for sailing vessels to come into the port regardless of wind conditions.
The Hudson is tidal to Troy, almost all the way up to Albany. It was called Muhekentuck, a river that flows two ways by the Lenape tribe, who formerly inhabited both banks of the lower portion of the river, all of present-day New Jersey and the island of Manhattan.
All of this was carved out during the last ice age, that ended some 10,000 to 20,000 years ago.
This is the area of North America covered by ice during the last ice age.
Note that the glaciers extend down to the present location of New York City. The ice shaped the present-day rivers and bays around the city. Direct evidence of this are these two glacial erratics in Central Park. These large boulders were transported by moving ice around 20,000 years ago, when the ice sheet covered this area to a depth of about 1,000 feet.
This is the Hudson River, with a view of Jersey City in the 1880s.
The East River is a tidal strait in New York City connecting Upper New York Bay on its south end to Long Island Sound on its north end.
The East River separates Long Island, including the boroughs of Queens and Brooklyn, from the island of Manhattan and the Bronx in reference to its connection to Long Island Sound. It was once also known as the Sound River.
The history of Broadway even predates the days of New Amsterdam. It was originally an Indian path, probably for trade goods, all of the way across Manhattan, and then an easy crossing over the narrow Harlem River to the mainland. Then it was an easy route by land or water up the Hudson River Valley, all the way up to present-day Albany.
The Dutch made a street out of the old Indian Trail and called it Breedeweg or Broadway, a name that it has retained to this day.
The old Indian Trail was called the Wecquaesgeek Trail, and ran from the southern tip of Manhattan, all of the way north across the island to the Harlem River, and then up the Hudson River Valley to the Mohawk River near present-day Albany. The Dutch explorer and entrepreneur David de Vries, in his journal for the year 1642, gives the first mention of it, the Wecquaesgeek Road over which the Indians passed daily.
Broadway was the first main street laid out in New Amsterdam. Note that Wall Street was so named because it ran along the protective wall of the settlement.
Fort Amsterdam was at the beginning of Broadway, at the lower tip of Manhattan.
This Dutch colony was then taken over by the British in 1674, and renamed New York City, by the Duke of York. Note that New York was originally written as a hyphenated word.
This is New Amsterdam today.
Except for the streets in the lower tip of Manhattan, especially in the area that was New Amsterdam, the streets follow a rectangular grid pattern. The big exception is Broadway, which runs in somewhat of a diagonal direction.
It is the diagonal path of Broadway intersecting the rectangular grid pattern that gives rise to the several so-called squares such as Times Square, Herald Square, and Madison Square that are actually acute triangles and not geometrical squares.
An example is Madison Square in the Flatiron Building, where Broadway crosses Fifth Avenue, at 23rd Street.
Another example is where Broadway crosses Amsterdam Avenue, producing triangular slivers of land called Sherman Square and Verdi Square.
Here is Broadway in Lower Manhattan. Battery Park is at the southern tip of the island, and the Wall Street financial district just to the north of that.
This is a view up Broadway from Bowling Green at the lower tip of Manhattan, with the Chrysler Building visible in the background.
Just to the east of Broadway in Lower Manhattan is the Lower East Side, City Hall, and Chinatown. The first theater district was in this part of Broadway in Lower Manhattan. It later moved uptown, first to Herald Square at 34th Street, and then later to Times Square near 42nd Street.
It is in this Lower East Side area that many of the immigrant groups that were so instrumental in the development of the Broadway Theater settled.
Here is the Lower East Side around the year 1900.
Now, how did the Broadway of Manhattan obtain its preeminent position as the center of the American musical theater?
Why didn't Boston or Philadelphia or Baltimore, or even Charleston rise to become center of the musical and dramatic theater in the United States?
Why not Market Street in Philadelphia? Or Boylston Street in Boston? Charles Street in Baltimore? Or even Charleston in South Carolina? All of these were great ports in colonial days and of a size to rival New York City.
The answer has to do primarily with geography and access to the hinterland,
and the Great Barrier posed by the Appalachian Mountains.
The original 13 colonies were confined to a strip along the Atlantic coast, between the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachian Mountains.
After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, the entire territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, known as the Northwest Territory, was opened for settlement.
The Appalachian Mountains were a formidable barrier for the transportation of people, agricultural produce, and goods between the Northwest Territory and the regions east of the mountains.
As the settlement of the region west of the mountains increased in the early 1800s, there was increasing interest in establishing a transportation route across the mountains. The lowest cost means of transportation at that time, before the advent of the railroads in the mid-1800s, was canals.
The Appalachian Mountains were a barrier to transportation from Maine to northern Georgia. There was only one gap that made a canal feasible. That was the Mohawk Valley in upstate New York.
In the early 1800s, it was proposed that a canal be dug from the Hudson River near Albany, through the Mohawk River Valley to Lake Erie.
The result was the Erie Canal.
This would establish an all-water transportation route from New York City, up the Hudson River to Albany, and then on the Erie Canal, from Albany to Lake Erie near Buffalo.
Construction on the Erie Canal started in 1817. By 1825 the canal was completed at a cost of little over $7 million.
Governor DeWitt Clinton and the state of New York were able to build a waterway that was 4 feet deep, 40 feet wide, and 363 miles long, connecting the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie, near Buffalo.
The canal was the most ambitious engineering project undertaken anywhere in the country up to that time.
This Erie Canal and Hudson River water route opened up the vast and fertile Midwest and linked it to the east coast of the U.S. at New York City. Agricultural products from the Midwest could now be shipped inexpensively to New York City, and then other ports along the East Coast and to Europe.
Manufactured products from Europe could now be shipped to New York City, and then inexpensively to the Midwest.
New York City was the center of all of this trade, and grew rapidly to become the largest city in the U.S.
In addition, large numbers of immigrants came from Europe to New York City.
Many went on to the West, but many stayed in New York City, giving it a large and cosmopolitan immigrant population. It is thus this rise to prominence of New York City, together with the financial power and the various immigrant groups, that produced the phenomenon known as Broadway.
The question still remains as to why Boston, or Philadelphia, or Baltimore, or even Charleston, did not rise to become center of the musical and dramatic theater in the United States.
Although Boston was a leading city in early America, a canal route to the west was blocked by the Berkshire Mountains in western Massachusetts and the Adirondacks in eastern New York State.
Philadelphia was the largest city in colonial America. The Allegheny Mountains, however, were a major barrier to canal building. Also, the major rivers in western Pennsylvania, the Delaware and the Susquehanna, ran mostly north to south.
The port of Philadelphia was established more than 300 years ago during the colonial period, and was for a time the busiest port in both that period and the earliest years of the new republic.
Philadelphia had the disadvantage, however, of being located 103 miles up the Delaware River from the ocean, and was finally eclipsed by the port of New York.
The Pennsylvania Canal, which connected Philadelphia to the Ohio River at Pittsburgh, was completed in 1834. However, by that time New York City, with its Erie Canal, completed almost 10 years earlier, had an unbeatable head start.
The Pennsylvania Canal faced far more obstacles than did the Erie Canal in going over the rugged Allegheny Mountains. Inclined planes and portage railroads were needed in some sections, making it far more expensive than the Erie Canal, and it was never profitable.
In 1852, the Pennsylvania Railroad was completed over the Allegheny Mountains from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, rendering the canal obsolete.
Later there were connections to the Great Lakes and the entire Midwest. However, a railroad connection paralleling the Erie Canal all of the way to the Great Lakes at Buffalo had been completed by 1842, so New York City maintained its primacy.
The geography that led to the leading role of New York City was also a factor in Pittsburgh. Situated at the beginning of the Ohio River at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers.
The development of steamboats in the 1840s and the arrival of the railroad in 1852 made Pittsburgh a major transportation and industrial center.
Baltimore was also a major city and port in colonial America. Again here, as in the case of Boston and Philadelphia, the mountains were a major barrier to canal building.
The Chesapeake and Ohio Canal was started in 1828 from a point near Washington, D.C., and was originally intended to reach the Ohio River at Pittsburgh. The canal was completed in 1850, but went only a distance of 185 miles to Cumberland, Maryland.
The Chesapeake and Ohio Canal was soon superseded by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which eventually went over the mountains to reach the Ohio River at Wheeling, Virginia, which is now West Virginia, in 1853. Although this gave Baltimore a big boost as a port, it was too late to compete with New York City.
In the case of Charleston, South Carolina, it was much further from the major European ports than New York City, and also the distance to the Midwest was much greater. So, it was never a serious contender.
In the Midwest, the Ohio and Erie Canal was completed in 1832 between Portsmouth on the Ohio River and Cleveland on Lake Erie. It gave rise to the great growth of Cleveland but was no match for the Erie Canal and New York City. Similarly, The Miami and Erie Canal was completed in 1845 between Cincinnati on the Ohio River and Toledo on Lake Erie. It gave rise to the great growth of both Cincinnati and Toledo. But again, it was no match for the Erie Canal in New York City. The Maumee River was originally called the Miami River, so there were at one time two Miami rivers in Ohio, both named after the same Ottawa tribe, the Miami, and not to be confused with the Miami of Florida. The two Miami regions of Ohio, North and South, were however connected in 1845 by the Miami and Erie Canal between Toledo and Cincinnati.
So, indeed, it is New York City, the Big Apple, and Broadway that became the focal point of the musical and dramatic theater in America.
Now, we will look at early Broadway theaters.
Perhaps the earliest Broadway theater was the John Street Theater. This is a program from 1785.
The John Street Theater opened in 1760 on John Street, just east of Broadway, in Lower Manhattan.
The beautiful Park Theater opened in 1810 on Park Row at City Hall Park, on Broadway, north from the Battery, and towards the villages of Greenwich and Harlem.
A second theater, the Bowery, was built in 1821 on the Bowery.
In the period 1865 to 1908, there is the Madison Square Theater at West 24th Street, between 6th Avenue and Broadway.
In 1882, we have the Casino Theater at Broadway and 39th Street.
The migration of downtown theaters towards the north was already underway in the mid to late 1800s.
And in 1893, there was the Empire Theater up at Broadway and 40th Street.
Here is a Currier and Ives painting showing the traffic on Broadway in the mid-1800s.
By the turn of the 20th century, theaters had reached up Broadway to 42nd Street and 7th Avenue, with the Oscar Hammerstein's Victoria Theater in 1899.
Followed by the Republic Theater in 1900, and the Lyric and the New Amsterdam Theaters in 1903, and the Lou Fields Theater in 1904.
In 1900, Broadway theaters extended from the Star Theater on 13th Street to the New York Theater on 45th Street. Patrons were paying $1.50 to $2 each for the best seats to see their favorite stars.
The massive Hippodrome stretched the entire block on 6th Avenue between 43rd and 44th, and could seat over 5,000. Its 4-hour premiere show in 1905 featured 280 chorus girls, 480 soldiers, an elephant parade, dancing horses, and a cavalry charge through a lake.
The stage and its mechanics and tanks were overwhelming to theatergoers. Though the spectacle shows were popular, the theater was soon in financial trouble. The Hippodrome was very soon to become another Schubert Theater.
Hippodrome stage spectacles were noticed nationwide. Here is a postcard view of the Court of the Golden Fountain seen from A Society Circus in 1905.
The Schubert brothers built and operated many Broadway theaters.
Here are the three Schubert brothers.
This is the New Amsterdam Theater in 1913, with the operetta, The Merry Widow, being performed.
This is a vintage postcard of the Winter Garden Theater on Broadway, between 50th and 51st Streets, in Midtown Manhattan.
Does anybody remember Longacre Square? Longacre Square is where Broadway intersects 7th Avenue. Does this scene look familiar?
In 1904, Longacre Square, where Broadway intersects 7th Avenue, was renamed Times Square in honor of the New York Times building that was just erected there.
6 months later, the Times Square subway station opened, which made this location easily accessible to the theater-going public. This started the boom in new theaters in this area of Broadway, and marked the beginning of the Broadway Theater District.
Here is Times Square in 1919.
Here is Times Square in 1931.
This is Times Square in the present day.
This is Times Square at dusk.
Times Square is where Broadway crosses 7th Avenue between 42nd Street and 44th Street. It's not really a square, but rather two acute triangular areas formed by the intersection of Broadway and 7th Avenue.
The Broadway Theater District today extends from West 41st Street, where the Nederlander Theater is located, up to West 53rd Street and the Broadway Theater.
Only 4 theaters are actually on Broadway itself. These being the Marquee at 46th Street, the Palace at 47th Street, the Winter Garden at 50th Street, and the Broadway at 53rd.
All the other Broadway theaters are located close by on side streets, east or west of this 12-block stretch of Broadway. How many Broadway theaters are actually on Broadway? And is a theater not on Broadway called an off-Broadway theater?
Only 4 Broadway theaters out of a total of 41 are actually on Broadway, and most others are on side streets, within a few blocks of Broadway. The Broadway theaters have 500 or more seats, with ticket prices generally upwards of $75.
Theaters in the range of about 100 to 499 seats are generally denoted as off-Broadway, with tickets ranging up to $45.
Theaters with 99 seats or less generally do not have to pay the union scale, and are considered off-Broadway, with tickets in the $20 range. This is Broadway in 1908.
Thus, the Broadway theaters made a gradual migration from Lower Broadway at the tip of Manhattan. They went first to the area around Herald Square, which is where Broadway, 6th Avenue, and 34th Street all intersect,
near the Empire State Building and Macy's department store.
And finally, up to the area on Broadway, near Times Square and 42nd Street.
Here is Macy's on 34th Street at Herald Square.
This movement of the theater district at Broadway, first to Herald Square and then to Times Square and 42nd Street, is immortalized in the famous George M. Cohan song, "Give My Regards to Broadway,"
with the lyrics, "Give my regards to Broadway. Remember me to Herald Square. Tell all the gang at 42nd Street that I will soon be there."
Here is Broadway at West 50th Street, also known as Gershwin Way.
This is the Winter Garden Theater, on Broadway, near West 50th Street.
This is Broadway at West 50th Street, looking south towards Times Square.
This is the Gilbert Theater, 225 West 44th Street near Broadway.
In 1866, the first musical comedy, The Crook, opened in New York City. It was later described as a combination of French romantic ballet and German melodrama. It attracted patrons of opera and serious drama, as well as those of burlesque shows.
The musical is set in the year 1600, in the Harz Mountains of Germany. It incorporates elements from Goethe's Faust, Weber's Der Freischütz and other well-known works. Evil wealthy Count Wolfenstein seeks to marry the lovely village girl, Amina. The Count arranges for Amina's fiancé to fall into the hands of Herzog, an ancient master of magic.
The Crook was a musical extravaganza. And for the first time ever, audiences saw drama, were entertained by an orchestra, and saw 100 gypsies on the stage.
A new, totally American art form, the Broadway musical, had been created.
A ballet troupe was brought over from France to perform at the Academy of Music. However, the building had burned down before the ballet troupe had a chance to perform.
The promoters of the ballet had invested a lot of money in bringing the troupe over from France, and needed to find an alternate place for the troupe to perform.
The theater options at that time in Manhattan were very limited.
One of the options was Niblo's Garden.
Niblo's Garden on Broadway, near Prince Street in Lower Manhattan, seated 3,200 people, and had the best equipped stage in the city.
But the theater was already committed to the production of The Crook, a second-rate play, with little chance of success.
The decision was made to incorporate the ballet troupe into the play, resulting in a musical extravaganza of more than 5 hours in length.
The addition to the play of music, songs, and most importantly, the somewhat scantily dressed dancing girls of the ballet troupe, made The Crook an instant success.
The Crook had a run of 16 months, and grossed over $1 million.
We will now have a short video about the play, The Crook. We will now have another short video about the play, The Crook. The success of The Crook in 1866 led to many other productions based on the same basic idea. Two different formats evolved.
One was the variety shows, such as burlesque vaudeville and revue, which had a series of unrelated acts or skits, not following any particular overall storyline.
The other format was the operetta and then later the book musical. The operettas were mostly of European origin and style. It is a musical drama that is generally comic or romantic in nature, and has songs and dance together with spoken dialogue. Table of contents. Click here to continue.